In the autumn of 1095, in a broad open field outside the French town of Clermont, an aging man climbed onto a wooden platform and began to speak. He had no army behind him. He held no crown. He commanded no treasury. He was, by the measures that the medieval world most respected, a man of words rather than deeds, of prayer rather than steel, of persuasion rather than compulsion. And yet within 4 years of that single hour of speaking, tens of thousands of people from across the length and breadth of Europe had sold their homes, mortgaged their estates, sewn strips of cloth into the shape of a cross upon their cloaks, and set out on foot and horseback toward a city that most of them had never seen, walking more than 2,000 miles across some of the most hostile terrain on earth. Many would die of thirst on the baked plains of Anatolia. Many more would perish of fever in the pestilential camps outside great walled cities. Others would fall to the arrows of Turkish horsemen, or drown crossing rivers, or simply collapse from hunger and exhaustion by the side of roads that seemed never to end. And what waited for the survivors at the far end of that long road, in the golden city of Jerusalem, would be remembered and argued over, celebrated and condemned, for nearly 1,000 years. The story of the First Crusade is one of the most astonishing stories in human history. It is a story about faith and ambition, about suffering and endurance, about the terrible things that human beings will do in the name of God. It is a story that contains within it almost every quality of which people are capable: extraordinary courage and squalid cruelty, genuine devotion and calculating selfishness, improbable heroism and shameful cowardice. It is a story that begins with a single speech in a French field and ends with a massacre in a holy city, and whose consequences reached so far forward in time that they are still felt, in a dozen different ways, in the world of today. To understand it properly, we must go back to the beginning, not to the field at Clermont, though that is where the match was struck. We must go back further, to the world as it existed in the 11th century, to understand why that match, when it was struck, found so much dry tinder waiting to burn. We must understand the world that produced the First Crusade before we can understand the First Crusade itself. The world before the Crusade. Chapter 1. Two Civilizations, One Faith. The 11th century was not a unified age. It would be a mistake of the most fundamental kind to imagine the Christian world of 1095 as a single coherent civilization moving forward with one purpose and one voice. The reality was far messier, far more fractured, and far more interesting than that. There were, in the broadest terms, two great Christian civilizations in existence at the time Urban II climbed onto his platform at Clermont, and they regarded each other with a mixture of condescension, suspicion, and occasional outright hostility that the modern observer might find startling in people who claimed to worship the same God. To the west lay the lands that we would now call France, Germany, England, Italy, and the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. These were the territories of the Latin Church, the church whose liturgy was conducted in the Latin language, whose ultimate authority rested in the Bishop of Rome, whom men called the Pope, and whose culture was a turbulent, often violent blend of the old Germanic tribal traditions, the Roman inheritance that the barbarian migrations had shattered but never entirely destroyed, and the Christian faith that had gradually bound them all together into something resembling a civilization. It was not a peaceful civilization. The patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, counties, and lordships that made up Western Christendom was in a state of almost constant internal warfare, as nobles fought over land and inheritance, kings struggled to subdue fractious vassals, and the church itself was locked in a bitter power struggle with the secular rulers who threatened its independence and its wealth. The landscape of Western Europe in this period was overwhelmingly rural. The great cities of the ancient Roman world, the engineering marvels of aqueducts and amphitheaters and broad paved roads, had largely crumbled into ruins or had shrunk to shadows of their former selves. Rome itself, the eternal city, had perhaps 30 or 40,000 inhabitants where once it had held 1 million. London was a small town. Paris was a collection of villages clustered around an island in a river. Only in southern Italy and in the Norman-ruled territories of the Mediterranean coast did something approaching urban life persist in the west, and even there the scale was modest compared to what lay to the east. The social order of Western Europe was built on a system that historians would later call feudalism, though the people who lived within it had no such tidy name for the arrangements that governed their lives. At its core, the system rested on a simple and ancient bargain. Those who held land granted portions of it to those below them in exchange for military service, and those who received land were bound by oaths of loyalty to those above them. A great lord might owe his allegiance to a king, who in turn might acknowledge the theoretical supremacy of the Holy Roman Emperor, who in theory ruled over all the Christian kingdoms of the West. In practice, these hierarchies were perpetually contested, perpetually renegotiated, and perpetually violated by men who placed their own interests above their oaths whenever they judged that they could do so without fatal consequences. The Church stood apart from this feudal hierarchy, and yet was deeply embedded within it. Bishops and abbots controlled vast estates and commanded significant military resources. The great monasteries were centers of learning, agriculture, and economic activity, as well as of prayer and scholarship. The parish priest was often the only literate person in a village, the keeper of records, the arbiter of disputes, the intermediary between the illiterate peasant and the incomprehensible world of written law and higher authority. And yet the Church was also corrupt, in ways that reformers of the period documented with bitter precision. Bishoprics were sold to the highest bidder, a practice known as simony after Simon Magus, who tried to purchase the gifts of the Holy Spirit in the Acts of the Apostles. Priests kept wives and concubines in open defiance of the celibacy that canon law demanded. Local lords appointed clergy to positions within their territories as casually as they appointed stewards or stable masters, treating the offices of the Church as elements of their own patronage systems. Against this corruption, the reforming movement centered on the great monastery of Cluny in Burgundy had been fighting for most of the 11th century. The Cluniac reform sought to free the Church from lay control, to enforce clerical celibacy, to stamp out simony, and above all to assert the supreme authority of the papacy over all Christian life, spiritual and temporal alike. It was from this reform movement that the man who would preach the First Crusade had come, and it was the ambitions of the reformed papacy, as much as any concern for distant Jerusalem, that would shape the enterprise he set in motion. Far to the east, separated from the Latin West by more than geography, stood the other great Christian civilization. This was the Byzantine Empire, ruled from the golden city of Constantinople on the western shore of the Bosphorus, the narrow waterway that divides the European and Asian continents. The Byzantines did not call themselves Byzantines. That name was the invention of later historians. They called themselves Romans, Rhomioi in their Greek language, and they meant it with complete and unironic sincerity. Their empire was, in their own understanding and in a very real historical sense, the direct continuation of the Roman Empire that had ruled the Mediterranean world for 1,000 years. When the western half of that empire had collapsed under the pressure of the barbarian migrations in the 5th century, the eastern half had survived. It had changed, certainly. The Latin language of the old Roman administration had given way to Greek. The empire's frontiers had contracted and expanded many times over the intervening centuries. The culture had absorbed influences from the Hellenistic world, from Persia, from the Christian faith that had become the empire's official religion under Constantine in the 4th century. But the sense of continuity, of being the heirs of Rome, persisted with remarkable tenacity through all these changes. Constantinople itself was a marvel of the medieval world that beggared description. It sat on a triangular peninsula where Europe met Asia, protected on 2 sides by water and on the third by a series of massive walls whose engineering would not be surpassed anywhere in the world until the age of gunpowder. Within those walls lived perhaps 400,000 people at its height, making it by far the largest city in Christendom and one of the largest in the world. Its markets traded in goods from as far east as China and as far south as sub-Saharan Africa. Its palaces were encrusted with gold, mosaic, and porphyry and silk. Its churches held relics of an antiquity and holiness that made the religious collections of Western Europe look impoverished by comparison. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, rose to a dome so vast that contemporaries said it seemed to hang suspended from heaven by a golden chain rather than resting on earthly foundations. The Byzantine Church, the Orthodox Church, shared the same fundamental Christian faith as the Latin Church of the West, believed in the same Christ and the same Trinity, and traced its origins to the same apostolic foundations. But the two churches had grown apart over the centuries in ways that went deeper than mere theological quibbling. They worshipped in different languages, Greek rather than Latin. They observed different liturgical practices. They had irreconcilable differences over the precise wording of the Nicene Creed, specifically over whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone, as the Greeks held, or from the Father and the Son together. The addition of the Latin word filioque that the Western Church had inserted into the Creed in a manner the Eastern Church considered both theologically erroneous and constitutionally unauthorized. And most fundamentally, they disagreed about the question of supreme authority within Christianity. The Romans of Constantinople acknowledged a primacy of honor to the Bishop of Rome, but denied him the absolute jurisdictional supremacy that the reforming papacy was increasingly claiming. The formal break between the two churches, the Great Schism, had taken place in 1054, only 41 years before the Council of Clermont, when the Pope's legate and the Patriarch of Constantinople had exchanged excommunications in the nave of Hagia Sophia in an act of mutual condemnation that would not be formally revoked until 1964. The two Christianities, Eastern and Western, were in 1095 deeply estranged from each other. They were rivals as much as cousins, each convinced that the other had strayed from the true path, each suspicious of the other's motives and ambitions. And yet the events that were about to unfold would throw them together in an alliance neither had fully wanted and neither would long sustain. Chapter 2: Islam and the Transformation of the East. Between these two Christian worlds lay a third civilization, vast and dynamic and deeply self-confident, that had been transforming the map of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula for more than 4 centuries. Islam, the faith revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, had spread with a speed that astonished and terrified the existing powers of the Mediterranean world. Within 100 years of the Prophet's death in 632, Muslim armies had conquered the Persian Empire, taken Egypt and all of North Africa from the Byzantines, crossed into Spain from Morocco, and reached as far east as the frontiers of India. The old Sassanid Persian Empire was gone entirely, absorbed into the new Islamic world. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, formerly the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire, were firmly in Muslim hands. The great city of Alexandria, once the intellectual capital of the ancient world, was now an Islamic city. The rapid expansion of Islam had been driven by several forces working in combination. The extraordinary military effectiveness of the Arab tribal warriors who formed its first armies, the administrative and ideological exhaustion of the Byzantine and Persian empires that they attacked, the appeal of the new faith's message of equality before God, and the genuine sense of divine mission that animated the early Muslims. But the Arab empires that had achieved these conquests had themselves fragmented by the 11th century into a welter of competing dynasties, rival caliphates, and regional powers that bore only a nominal relationship to the unified Islamic community of the early centuries. The most significant development in the Islamic world in the century before the Crusade was the rise of the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a Turkic-speaking people who had migrated from the steppes of Central Asia, converted to Sunni Islam, and built a powerful empire that by the mid-11th century controlled Persia, Iraq, and much of the Near East. They were superb warriors, particularly in the mounted archery tradition of the Central Asian steppes, and they brought to the Islamic world a military energy that had been flagging in the older Arab dynasties. Under their great Sultan Tughril and his successors, the Seljuks established themselves as the dominant power in the Sunni Islamic world, claiming the title of Sultan, a word meaning authority, and positioning themselves as the protectors of the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, whom they reduced in practice to a figurehead while wielding the real power themselves. For the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuk Turks represented an existential threat of a kind not seen in centuries. Previous Muslim powers had established a kind of equilibrium with Byzantium, raiding across the frontier, occasionally pushing it back, but never fundamentally threatening the empire's survival. The Seljuks were different. They were expanding aggressively into Anatolia, the peninsula that is now Turkey, which was the Byzantine heartland, the source of most of the empire's soldiers, much of its agricultural wealth, and a large portion of its tax revenue. The loss of Anatolia would not merely weaken the Byzantine Empire, it would destroy it. The catastrophe that announced the scale of the Seljuk threat came in the year 1071, at a place called Manzikert near Lake Van in eastern Anatolia. There, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes marched out with what was supposed to be the largest and best-equipped army the empire had assembled in generations, intent on driving the Seljuks back from the frontier and securing Anatolia once and for all. What followed was one of the most consequential defeats in the history of the Byzantine Empire. Chapter 3: The Disaster at Manzikert. The Battle of Manzikert on August 19, 1071, has been called the turning point of Byzantine history, and that description, for once, is not an exaggeration. To understand what happened there, and why it mattered so profoundly, it is necessary to understand the Byzantine army of the 11th century, which was in many ways a more sophisticated and experienced fighting force than its Latin counterpart in the West, but which suffered from political and structural weaknesses that no amount of military skill could entirely overcome. The Byzantine army was not a feudal host in the Western sense. It was a professional force, paid in cash and land grants, organized along lines that owed something to the old Roman legions and something to the innovations of later Byzantine military thinkers, whose tactical manuals survive to this day. Its core consisted of the Tagmata, the elite guard regiments stationed in and around Constantinople, which included the famous Varangian Guard, a unit of northern warriors, mostly Scandinavians and, by the late 11th century, increasingly Englishmen who had fled their homeland after the Norman conquest of 1066. The Varangians were paid extremely well and were renowned for their ferocious effectiveness in close-quarter combat, each man armed with the great two-handed battle axe that was their trademark weapon. Around this professional corps were organized the provincial military forces, the thematic armies raised in the great administrative divisions of the empire called themes. The thematic system had worked superbly in the 7th and 8th centuries, when the themes of Anatolia had provided a deep reservoir of military manpower drawn from the farmers and smallholders of the Anatolian plateau. But by the 11th century, the system was in serious trouble. The great aristocratic families had been buying up the small holdings that had supported the free peasant soldiers, converting them into large estates worked by dependent labor. The independent farmers who had filled the thematic roles were disappearing, and the military effectiveness of the themes was declining with them. Emperor Romanos IV, who came to power in 1068, understood the threat and was determined to address it. He was a capable soldier and an energetic emperor. and he launched a series of campaigns into eastern Anatolia, specifically designed to push the Seljuk raiding parties back and stabilize the frontier. For a time, he had some success. But the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan was not a passive opponent, and in 1071, he led a major army into Byzantine territory, which forced Romanos to commit to a decisive confrontation. Romanos marched east in the summer of 1071, with an army that ancient sources put at numbers clearly inflated by later writers, but which was substantial by any standard. Modern historians estimate perhaps 40,000 men in total, of varying quality. The elite Varangian and other palace units, provincial thematic troops, and a large contingent of mercenaries, including Turkic warriors who fought in the Seljuk manner and whose loyalty was, as events would prove, entirely contingent on the fortunes of the battle. The engagement at Manzikert went wrong for Romanos almost from the beginning. Part of the Byzantine force had been detached on a side mission and was not available when the main battle was joined. The Seljuk cavalry, masters of the feigned retreat that had won so many engagements for Central Asian horsemen, drew the Byzantine advance too far forward and then turned and enveloped it. When the emperor sent orders to his rear commanding them to close up, one of his political rivals, the general Andronikos Doukas, interpreted the order as a signal of retreat and turned his forces around and marched them off the field. Whether this was misunderstanding or deliberate betrayal, the sources disagree, but the effect was catastrophic either way. The Byzantine center was left exposed, and as the Seljuk cavalry closed from all sides, the imperial army dissolved. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, wounded in the fighting, was captured alive on the battlefield. This was an almost unprecedented humiliation for a Roman ruler. The very concept of the emperor being taken prisoner by a barbarian enemy was so alien to Byzantine political tradition that there was essentially no protocol for it. Sultan Alp Arslan, a man of considerable sophistication and political intelligence, treated his royal prisoner with a courtesy that his own subjects would not extend to him. He made Romanos kiss the ground before him, then raised him up and sat him beside him, negotiated a ransom and a treaty, and sent him home. At home, Romanos found that his political enemies had moved fast in his absence. While he was a prisoner, a coup had placed his young stepson on the throne. When Romanos returned and tried to assert his rights, he was captured, blinded, and left to die of his wounds, which he did within a few months. It was a sordid end for a man who had genuinely tried to save his empire, and it left the throne in the hands of the Doukas family, whose members had contributed to the disaster at Manzikert, and who now presided over the even greater disaster that followed. For the loss of the Battle of Manzikert was not in itself fatal. Byzantine armies had been defeated before and had recovered. What was fatal was what happened in the years after. With the imperial government in chaos, torn by civil war and faction fighting, with different generals and aristocratic clans simultaneously fighting each other for the throne, the defense of Anatolia simply collapsed. The Seljuk Sultan did not need to conquer the peninsula province by province. He did not need to fight for it. Byzantine commanders fighting each other for power invited Turkish warbands into Anatolia as mercenaries and allies, paying them with land. The Turkic nomads, following their leaders and their flocks, drifted into the power vacuum that the Byzantine civil wars had created. Town by town, valley by valley, the great Anatolian plateau that had been the heartland of the Roman Empire for 7 centuries passed out of Byzantine control. By the early 1080s, Turkish-ruled territories extended almost to the shores of the Bosphorus. A Turkish prince named Süleyman ibn Qatalmish had established himself at Nicaea, a city so close to Constantinople that, on a clear day, the smoke from its chimneys was visible from the walls of the imperial capital. The great Christian cities of Anatolia, places like Ancyra, Iconium, and Caesarea, which had been under Roman rule since the days of the actual Caesars, were now in the hands of Turkish lords who had arrived on horseback from the Central Asian steppes within living memory. Chapter 4. Alexios Komnenos, the Survivor. Into this catastrophe stepped the man whose decisions, more than those of any other single individual, would set the first crusade in motion. His name was Alexios Komnenos, and he was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable figures of the Byzantine 11th century, a survivor of extraordinary political skill, a general of real talent, a diplomat of infinite patience, and a man whose pragmatic intelligence operated with a cold clarity that left him few illusions about the world as it was. Alexios came from the Komnenian family, one of the great military dynasties of the Byzantine aristocracy. He had spent his youth in the field, earning a reputation for personal courage and military competence in a succession of difficult campaigns. He had also, from an early age, demonstrated the equally important Byzantine skill of political navigation, moving through the factional landscapes of the imperial court with a sure instinct for where the power lay and how to position himself in relation to it. In 1081, at the age of around 23 or 24, Alexios Komnenos seized the throne in a coup that his own family had organized with the support of several other great aristocratic clans. It was the kind of coup that Byzantine history was littered with, and it succeeded for the usual reasons: superior military resources, excellent timing, and the willingness to move decisively before the opposition could organize. The reigning emperor, Nikephoros III Botaniates, was old, unpopular, and without the means to resist. He abdicated and retired to a monastery, and Alexios I Komnenos was crowned emperor of the Romans. He inherited an empire that was bleeding from every wound at once. The Seljuk Turks held most of Anatolia. From the north, the Pechenegs, a fierce nomadic people of the Pontic steppes, were raiding across the Danube into Byzantine territory with increasing frequency and violence. From the west came the Normans, those restless and brilliantly effective warriors from northern France who had already conquered England and southern Italy, and who were now extending their ambitions eastward under their leader Robert Guiscard, the most dangerous of them all. Robert had his eye on Byzantine territory in the Balkans, and he pursued that ambition with a military effectiveness that cost Alexios a series of bitter campaigns in the early years of his reign. Alexios survived all of these threats, though only just. He defeated the Pechenegs in 1091 at the Battle of Livounion, a victory so complete that it effectively ended the Pecheneg threat to Byzantium permanently. He managed the Norman threat through a combination of arms and diplomacy, helped considerably by Robert Guiscard's death in 1085, which deprived the Normans of their most brilliant leader at a critical moment. He bought time against the Seljuks through negotiation and the careful management of what limited resources he had, avoiding the kind of decisive military confrontation that had destroyed his predecessor at Manzikert. But buying time was not a solution. The Anatolian heartland remained in Turkish hands, and without it, the empire could not raise the armies or collect the taxes it needed to maintain itself. Alexios needed soldiers, more soldiers than Byzantium could produce from its own diminished resources, and he knew where such soldiers might be found. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had supplemented its own forces with mercenaries hired from the vigorous military cultures of Western Europe. The Varangian Guard was only the most famous example of a long tradition, and Western Europe in 1095 was, from a Byzantine perspective, a place overflowing with heavily armed men who had no permanent employment and every reason to go somewhere else and fight. In the spring of 1095, the Emperor Alexios sent ambassadors westward, bearing a letter to the Pope. We do not know the precise contents of that letter. The original has not survived, and the various accounts of it that do survive were written later and colored by what the Crusade subsequently became. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Alexios was asking for help. He wanted soldiers. He wanted what emperors had always wanted from the West: useful mercenaries who would fight for pay and go home when they were no longer needed. He was not asking for a holy war. He was not asking for a mass migration. He was certainly not asking for the permanent colonization of the Middle East by European noblemen. He was asking for a manageable augmentation of his military resources that would allow him to recover some of what had been lost in Anatolia. What he received was something he had never imagined and could not have controlled even if he had wanted to. The Call. Chapter 5. Urban II, the Pope who changed history. The man who received Alexios's request was named Odo of Chatillon, though history knows him as Pope Urban II. He was French by birth, from a noble family in the Champagne region, and he had spent the formative years of his career as a monk, and then prior at the great monastery of Cluny, the very heart of the reform movement that was trying to cleanse the Church of corruption and assert the supremacy of papal authority over the whole of Christian life. From Cluny, he had been called to Rome to serve as a cardinal and trusted assistant to the reforming Pope Gregory VII, the man who had fought the most bitter and consequential battle with secular authority that the medieval papacy had yet waged. Gregory VII's conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over the question of who had the right to appoint bishops, the investiture controversy, had nearly destroyed the papacy. It had produced the extraordinary spectacle of an emperor standing barefoot in the snow at Canossa in January 1077, performing public penance before the Pope in order to secure the lifting of an excommunication that had threatened to dissolve the loyalty of his subjects. It had also produced a counteroffensive by Henry that drove Gregory from Rome and set up a rival, anti-Pope Clement III, in his place. Gregory had died in exile in 1085, with his cause apparently in ruins. Urban inherited all of this chaos when he was elected pope in 1088. For years, he could not even safely reside in Rome, which was occupied by the forces of the anti-pope supported by the emperor. He traveled through Italy and France, building coalitions, restoring the authority of the legitimate papacy step by step, all the while managing the ongoing struggle with the emperor and trying to present a united front to the Christian world. By the time the Byzantine ambassadors arrived with Alexios's letter at the Council of Piacenza in March 1095, Urban had been rebuilding papal authority for 7 years. He was an intelligent, experienced, politically sophisticated man who had seen exactly how badly things could go wrong when the papacy overreached or mismanaged its resources. He was also, underneath the diplomat's caution, a man of genuine religious conviction who believed profoundly in the mission he had inherited, the spiritual reform of Christendom and the assertion of papal leadership over all Christian life. When he heard the Byzantine appeal, he did not hear a small administrative problem. He heard an opportunity unlike any other that had presented itself in his pontificate. Here, if handled correctly, was a chance to reunite the two halves of Christendom that had been formally estranged since 1054. Here was a way to channel the destructive energies of the Western nobility, the ceaseless warfare of the feudal system, toward a purpose that the Church itself would direct, and in which the Pope would be the central figure. Here was a way to enhance the prestige of the papacy immeasurably at a moment when that prestige needed all the help it could get. And here in the background was the holy city of Jerusalem, the spiritual center of the Christian world, a city where Christ had walked and died and risen, a city in the hands of Muslims and therefore, in the imagination of Western Christendom, a city crying out for liberation. Urban spent the summer and autumn of 1095 preparing carefully for what he was about to do. He traveled through France, his homeland, meeting with the powerful and gauging the mood. He held councils, built support, laid the groundwork. The great gathering he had planned came in late November at Clermont, in the Auvergne region of central France. For more than a week, a large council of bishops and abbots met to deal with the business of church reform. the usual matters of discipline and administration that kept the ecclesiastical machinery running. But everyone who attended knew that the Pope was building towards something larger, and when he announced that he would address the public on the last day of the council, the word went out and the people came. Knights and townspeople and farmers, clergy and laypeople, the noble and the humble, far too many to fit inside any church building. A wooden platform was erected in an open field outside the town, and there, on a cold day in late November 1095, Urban II climbed up to speak. Chapter 6. The Speech at Clermont. We do not know exactly what Urban said. This is one of the strangest and most humbling facts about one of the most consequential speeches in human history. The address that launched the First Crusade, that set in motion a movement which would reshape the medieval world, survives only in versions written down months or years later by men who were attempting to reconstruct it from memory, or who had not even been present and were working from the accounts of others. Several such reconstructions exist, written by chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres, Robert the Monk, Baldric of Burgil, and Guibert of Nogent, and they differ from each other in detail, emphasis, and wording in ways that make it impossible to recover the original text with any confidence. What the various accounts agree on is the general structure and thrust of what Urban said. He told the assembled crowd that Christians in the East were suffering terribly under the Turks. He described in vivid and certainly exaggerated terms the desecration of holy places, the murder and enslavement of pilgrims, the defilement of churches. He reminded them that Jerusalem, the city where Christ himself had lived and taught and died and risen from the dead, lay in the hands of unbelievers. He pointed to the endless wars of Western Christendom, the knights killing each other over boundaries and inheritances and petty feuds, and he asked them to turn their weapons to a better purpose. And then he made the offer that made everything else possible. He offered an indulgence, specifically a remission of the temporal punishment due to sin, to any man who took the cross and went on this expedition with a pure heart and the right intention. The theology behind this offer was complex and would be debated by canon lawyers for centuries afterward, but its practical meaning to the audience was clear enough. The sins of a lifetime, the violence and the cruelty and the lust and the greed that were inseparable from the lives of fighting men in this world, could be wiped away by the act of going on this journey. The sword, which had always been associated with sin, could become an instrument of salvation. The skill at war that knights had been told was a mark of their moral danger could now become the path to their redemption. For a society that lived in constant awareness of sin and constant fear of the divine judgment to come, this was an offer of staggering power. The medieval man did not face death with the comfortable detachment of the secular modern imagination. He faced it knowing that every sin he had committed would be weighed against him, that the suffering of purgatory and the possibility of hell were not metaphors but realities, and that the gap between the life he led and the life God demanded of him was, in most cases, very wide indeed. Urban was telling these men that the gap could be closed, that the journey to Jerusalem was the penance that would cover it all. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By every account, the crowd erupted at some point in Urban's address with a roar that became the slogan of the whole enterprise. Deus lo vult, or Deus le vult, God wills it, in the Latin of the clergy and the rough French of the laity. People surged forward to take the vow on the spot. A cardinal knelt and begged to be the first to take it. Men tore strips of cloth and sewed them into the shape of a cross on their clothing, a gesture that gave the whole enterprise its later name. The word crusade itself did not exist at Clermont. Those who pledged called themselves pilgrims, or those signed with the cross, crucis ignati in the Latin. The grand abstract noun came later. To the people in that field on that November day, it was simply the journey, the holy pilgrimage, the work of God. Urban was not swept away by the enthusiasm he had created. He was a careful, organized man, and he had thought through the practical dimensions of what he was proposing. He set a departure date, The Feast of the Assumption, August 15 of the following year, 1096, after the harvest, so that armies would have food to take with them. He appointed a personal representative to travel with the expedition and give it spiritual leadership. Bishop Edhemer of Lippi, a man of real ability who had actually made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and who commanded respect among both the clergy and the lay nobility. He tried to specify who should and should not go: the old, the sick, the infirm, the clergy without their superior's permission. All of these should stay home. This was to be a military expedition, organized and effective, not a mass migration. What Urban got was a mass migration, and more than that, what he got was something no institution, however well organized, could fully manage: a movement. Chapter 7: The Fire Spreads. After Clermont, Urban spent months touring through France, repeating and refining his message, and the response he found everywhere was the same: overwhelming enthusiasm that defied the careful conditions he tried to impose. Letters and rumors raced ahead of him, and ahead of the letters ran something more powerful than either: the spoken word, passing from mouth to mouth, transforming and simplifying as it went, until what arrived in the villages and market towns of northern France and the Rhineland was not Urban's careful, theologically precise appeal to aid the Eastern Church and recover the holy places, but something much simpler and much more powerful: go to Jerusalem, fight the enemies of God, win heaven. The simplification was inevitable. The Church's communication network in the 11th century was sophisticated by the standards of the age but still dependent on the spoken word for its reach into the population at large. A papal letter could travel quickly to the major bishops and abbots, but it could not travel quickly to the peasant in his field or the small farmer at his village market. What reached those people was what a preacher told them, and preachers, authorized and unauthorized alike, were now taking Urban's message and carrying it everywhere. Among those preachers, none was more effective and none more consequential than a small, intense, barefoot man from the region of Amiens in northern France, who traveled on a donkey and wore a rough woolen cloak and had a gift for moving crowds to tears, and then to action that no bishop and no pope could match. His name was Peter, and he was known as the Hermit, though he was not, strictly speaking, a hermit in the traditional sense. He was a preacher, a wandering evangelist of the old charismatic tradition, and when the message of Clermont found him, he became its most electrifying carrier. Peter had, it seemed, been to Jerusalem. He had been there as a pilgrim, perhaps in the early 1090s, and he brought back from that journey a personal experience of the holy places and a personal sense of the suffering of Eastern Christians under Turkish rule that gave his preaching a vividness and an urgency that more scholarly appeals lacked. He spoke not of theological principles or church politics, but of what he had seen: churches profaned, pilgrims robbed and murdered, the holy places of Christ's own life in the hands of those who denied him. Whether his account was strictly accurate is less important than the effect it had. People wept, people pledged, people sewed crosses onto their clothes and prepared to follow him. Peter traveled through northern France and then into the German-speaking lands of the Rhineland in the late winter and early spring of 1096, and everywhere he went the crowds that gathered around him were enormous, and the enthusiasm was absolute. People touched his cloak as they would touch a holy relic. They pulled hairs from his donkey. They treated him as a saint, as a prophet, as a direct messenger from God. And they did not ask whether they were old enough or young enough or rich enough or experienced enough to go. They simply went. The crowd that gathered around Peter the Hermit was unlike any military force the world had seen or would see again for a very long time. It was a true mass movement of ordinary people. Farmers who had sold or abandoned their tools, tradespeople who had walked away from their trades, women and children and the elderly, the destitute and the desperate, a fair number of the simply excited and adventurous, all swept up in the conviction that God was calling them personally, that the end of the world might be near and Jerusalem was the place to be when it came, and that no requirement of practical wisdom or military experience should stand between them and the will of God. They had little money. They had almost no food stores. They had, in many cases, only the haziest idea of how far Jerusalem actually was, and there is a story, very likely true to the spirit of the thing if not to the letter, that as the great mass of people moved eastward through Europe, the children in the crowd would point at every large town they passed and ask whether this, at last, was Jerusalem. Chapter 8. The first victims, the Rhineland massacres. Before the great tide of common people even left Western Europe, before Peter the Hermit had led his followers across the Rhine and down the Danube road toward Constantinople, the crusading movement produced its first great atrocity. And its victims were not Muslims in distant Palestine, but Jews in the cities of the Rhineland, people who had lived among their Christian neighbors for generations, who had built communities of learning and commerce in the great towns along the river, and who had nothing whatever to do with the pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem or the Turkish occupation of Anatolia. The logic that produced the massacres was simple, terrible, and entirely internal to the crusading ideology as some of its most violent adherents understood it. If the journey was about fighting the enemies of Christ, some asked, why travel thousands of miles to do it when the enemies of Christ, as they defined them, lived in the towns and cities around them? The Jews of the Rhineland, in the theology of the more extreme crusading preachers, were the killers of Christ, enemies of Christianity living in the midst of Christian society, and it made a kind of savage internal sense to those who had accepted the most inflammatory version of the crusading message, to deal with them first before marching east. The men who led these attacks were not, in most cases, the great lords who would eventually lead the organized crusade. They were minor knights and demagogues of the People's Crusade movement, men like Count Emicho of Leiningen, who used the excitement and the ideology of the Holy War to lead a series of savage attacks on Jewish communities in the spring of 1096. Beginning in Speyer in early May, then moving to Worms, Mainz, Cologne, and other cities, bands of crusaders and local mobs fell upon the Jewish quarters, offering conversion or death, and killing thousands of men, women, and children who refused to abandon their faith. In several cities, the local bishops tried to protect the Jewish communities, opening their palaces and churches to provide refuge, sometimes at real personal risk. At Speyer, Bishop Johann gave shelter to the Jews and had those who had attacked them punished. At Mainz, the Archbishop Ruthard tried to shelter the community but was overwhelmed when Count Emicho's forces broke through. The Jewish accounts of these events, written afterward by survivors and their descendants, describe scenes of extraordinary horror. Families killing their own children rather than allowing them to be converted, communities burning themselves in their synagogues, individuals choosing death over apostasy, with a steadiness that their murderers could not have anticipated. The Church had not called for this. Pope Urban's message had been aimed at the Muslim East, not the Jewish communities of Europe. But the ideological force he had unleashed could not be aimed with the precision he intended, and those who were in its path at home paid for it with their lives. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 were the first large-scale pogrom in European history, the first time the crusading idea was turned against Jews rather than Muslims, and they would not be the last. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland would remember these events for generations, weaving them into the liturgy of mourning that still marks the memory of martyrs, and the pattern they established, of religious enthusiasm metastasizing into violence against Jews, would repeat itself with terrible regularity throughout the crusading era and beyond. The People's Crusade. Chapter 9. The March of the Multitude. Peter the Hermit set out from Cologne in April 1096 at the head of an enormous and completely disorganized mass of people. The numbers given by medieval chroniclers are almost certainly exaggerated, as medieval numbers almost always are, but the crowd was enormous by any standard. Tens of thousands of people, perhaps as many as 40,000. though likely somewhat fewer, streaming eastward along the road through Germany toward Hungary, bound for the far shores of the Bosphorus and the distant city of Jerusalem. Among them was a small contingent of real fighting men. Walter Sansavoir, known to history by the unfortunate sobriquet Sansavoir, meaning without possessions, which later translators rendered charitably as Walter the Penniless, was a minor French knight who traveled with his own small following and provided something approaching military leadership to the portion of the crowd that followed him. But Walter was a minor figure, and his contingent was a tiny island of military competence in a vast sea of civilian enthusiasm. The problem with the People's Crusade became apparent almost as soon as it crossed into Hungary. A crowd of tens of thousands of people with no supply train, no food stores worth speaking of, and no money to buy provisions had to eat. And when the local markets were insufficient to feed them, as they frequently were, or when the local authorities refused to sell to them at the prices they demanded, the Crusaders took what they needed by force. Crops were stripped from fields, livestock was seized, villages were raided, and when the local garrison and the townspeople fought back, as they inevitably did, the raiding turned to battle, the battle to massacre, and the massacre to more destruction. In Hungary, where the Crusaders passed through the kingdom of Kalaman, there were several violent incidents. At Niš in Bulgaria, a dispute at a market escalated into a full-scale battle in which significant numbers on both sides were killed, and the Crusaders lost much of the baggage they had been carrying. By the time the survivors straggled toward Constantinople in the high summer of 1096, they had already lost a large number of their people, not to Turks or to the hardships of distant lands, but to violence with the very Christian populations through whose territories they were supposedly marching to salvation. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, watching the approach of this enormous, disorderly, hungry, and potentially dangerous mass from behind the walls of Constantinople, was not pleased. He had asked for trained soldiers. He had received, in the first instance, a vast camp of starving civilians, some minor knights of debatable quality, and a charismatic barefoot preacher on a donkey, all of them hungry, excitable, and prone to looting whatever was not defended. The scene was almost farcical, except that the scale of it made it genuinely dangerous. Alexios did what Byzantine emperors did best in such situations. He managed the problem with a combination of generosity, political skill, and firm pressure. He gave Peter an audience. He distributed money and provisions to the crowd. He provided markets at controlled prices. And then, with all possible speed and tact, he arranged for the entire chaotic multitude to be ferried across the Bosphorus to the Asian shore, out of his city and out of his immediate problem. He urged them, earnestly and with every diplomatic courtesy at his disposal, to wait on the Asian shore for the proper crusading armies that were still forming in Europe, and not to provoke the Turks before those armies arrived. The advice was excellent. It was nearly entirely ignored. Chapter 10. Disaster at Sivtot. On the Asian shore, the discipline that had never really existed in the People's Crusade collapsed entirely. The mass of people, freed from the immediate pressure of Alexios's watchful eyes and his carefully managed hospitality, broke into factions, squabbled, raided the surrounding countryside, and showed an absolute and eventually fatal inability to follow instructions that might have kept them alive. The Turkish Sultan who ruled these territories was Kilij Arslan I, the Sultan of Rum, a young, capable, and very angry man. He had been present at the destruction of Nicaea only recently and knew the region intimately. He had watched the approach of the People's Crusade and had initially assumed, based on the quality of what he had seen, that these were the Frankish forces he had been warned about. When Peter the Hermit's people revealed themselves to be essentially a mob rather than an army, Kilij Arslan relaxed. He could deal with a mob in his own time. The Crusaders raided out from their camp at Sivtot on the Sea of Marmara, pushing deeper and deeper into Turkish territory, each foray growing bolder than the last. A contingent of French and German crusaders quarreled over who would get to attack Nicaea first. One group seized a small castle called Zerigorden and occupied it, only to be surrounded by Turkish forces, cut off from water in the summer heat, and eventually offered the choice of conversion to Islam or death. Most chose death. The rest converted and were enslaved. The news of the disaster at Zerigorden, when it reached the main camp at Sivtat, set off exactly the kind of impulsive, uncoordinated reaction that was the People's Crusade's defining characteristic. A rumor swept the camp that a German and Italian faction had actually captured Nicaea and was at that moment dividing the loot without sharing it with the others. Furious at being excluded from glory and plunder they had not earned, the bulk of the host poured out of the camp and marched down the road toward Nicaea in no order whatsoever, with the women and children and elderly trailing along behind the fighting men, strung out along miles of road through broken terrain. Kilij Arslan had been waiting for exactly this moment. His horse archers fell on the straggling column from the hills on either side and shattered it within minutes. The Crusaders were driven back in a rout, pursued and cut down by the thousands. Those who fled back to the camp at Sivtat found it overrun. A few hundred managed to reach an old crumbling castle by the sea and hold out long enough to be rescued by Byzantine ships that Alexios sent when he received word of the catastrophe. The rest were killed or captured and enslaved. The People's Crusade, which had set out from Cologne in April 1096 with perhaps 40,000 souls, full of certainty that God walked beside them, had effectively ceased to exist by October of the same year, without ever having come within 500 miles of Jerusalem. Their bones lay in heaps on the Anatolian shore, and Greek sailors who passed by in the months that followed reported that the Turks had piled them into a great mound, a grim marker of the place where the first wave of the Crusade had broken against the reality of war in Asia. Peter the Hermit survived. He had returned to Constantinople before the final disaster to plead for supplies and reinforcements, and so was absent when the catastrophe he had spent months building toward finally arrived. He would later rejoin the organized crusade and march all the way to Jerusalem, a diminished figure by then, stripped of his early magnetism and his ability to move multitudes, but present at the end nonetheless. The story of the People's Crusade is, in miniature, the story of the entire crusading movement seen through a glass darkly. Faith outrunning capability, enthusiasm substituting for preparation, the holy impulse producing human catastrophe. Kilij Arslan, for his part, drew a lesson from his easy victory that would prove dangerously wrong. He had faced the warriors of the West, destroyed them with minimal effort, and concluded that these Franks were an overrated rabble. They were brave, perhaps, in the frenzied and undisciplined way of fanatics, but no real threat to a properly organized Turkish army. It was a reasonable conclusion from the evidence available to him. It was also a conclusion that the armies now forming in Western Europe were about to give him a great deal of time to reconsider. The Lords take the cross. Chapter 11, The Men Who Would Lead. While Peter the Hermit was leading his followers to their destruction on the plains of Anatolia, a very different kind of crusade was taking shape in the castles and courts of Western Europe. The message of Clermont had reached not only the poor and the credulous and the desperately devout, but also the great lords and their military followings, the men who actually knew how to organize and supply a military expedition, who had the resources to fund it and the experience to lead it, and whose participation would make the difference between a mass movement and a conquering army. These men were the warrior aristocracy of 11th century Europe, the men who sat at the top of the feudal pyramid, who held great estates and commanded the military service of hundreds of knights, who had spent their lives in the practice of war and the administration of territory. They came from different kingdoms and spoke different languages, and they brought with them very different personalities, very different ambitions, and very different conceptions of what the crusade was about and what it should accomplish. It is worth noting, as a matter of historical curiosity and some significance, that not a single reigning king of Western Europe joined the First Crusade. Philip I of France was under excommunication, having put aside his legitimate wife to live with a married woman, and could not lead a holy expedition in that condition. Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, was in the midst of his long bitter struggle with the reforming papacy, and was in no position to cooperate with a papal enterprise of any kind. William Rufus of England had no interest in crusading adventures, and his relationship with the Church was fraught with its own complications. So the leadership of the expedition fell to the next rank down, the great counts and dukes, men of enormous power and influence within their own territories, but men without the overriding authority that a king would have brought to the venture. This absence of royal authority would prove to be one of the Crusades' defining structural problems, a void at the center of the enterprise that no amount of papal legation or military ability could entirely fill. Chapter 12. Raymond of Toulouse, the Elder Statesman. The most senior figure among the crusading lords in terms of both age and wealth was Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse and Saint-Gilles, the ruler of much of what is now southern France. Raymond was in his mid to late 50s when he took the cross, which made him by the standards of the age an old man, and he had spent those decades accumulating wealth, territory, and experience in a way that made him, on paper, the natural leader of the whole enterprise. He was enormously rich. The county of Toulouse controlled major trade routes and agricultural land across a wide swath of southern France, and Raymond had managed his inheritance shrewdly enough to make it one of the most prosperous noble estates in Western Christendom. He was experienced in warfare, having fought campaigns against Muslims in Spain as part of the ongoing Reconquista that was pushing the Islamic rulers of the Iberian Peninsula back toward Africa. He was deeply, genuinely pious, in a way that his behavior throughout the crusade would both demonstrate and complicate. And he had a sense of his own importance and dignity that was so fully developed as to constitute a kind of magnificent and sometimes maddening rigidity. Raymond was the first of the great lords to take the cross, and he did so in a way that made clear he intended this to be permanent. He vowed never to return to France. He brought his wife and young son with him. He distributed his wealth with a generosity that went beyond the political calculation of buying goodwill, though it did that too, into something that looked genuinely like the act of a man who believed he was setting out on the last great adventure of his earthly life, and meant to spend his treasure on it rather than leave it behind. Traveling in Raymond's retinue was Bishop Adhemer of Lepi, the Pope's personal representative to the crusade. This association gave Raymond's contingent a special prestige and implied, at least in Raymond's own mind, a kind of leadership role over the whole expedition that would prove increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of the other lords' refusal to recognize it. Chapter 13. Godfrey of Bouillon, the Pious Duke. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, presented a striking contrast to Raymond in almost every respect. Where Raymond was old, shrewd, and had the comfortable authority of a man accustomed to getting his way, Godfrey was younger, physically imposing, famously pious to the point of austerity, and possessed of a straightforward soldierly quality that made him personally admired even when his political judgment was questioned. Godfrey was a large man, tall and fair, with a reputation for personal courage that was entirely genuine. He had fought in the service of the Holy Roman Emperor and was by the standards of his age an experienced military commander. But he was not a rich man, not by the standards of Raymond of Toulouse. His duchy of Lower Lorraine was modest in resources, and to fund his crusade, he did what the crusade would require of most of its participants. He stripped his assets. He sold what he could sell and mortgaged what he could mortgage, raising the enormous sums needed to equip and provision a substantial military force for a journey that would take years and lead to the end of the known world. With Godfrey came his brothers. The eldest, Eustace III of Boulogne, was a significant lord in his own right. The youngest, Baldwin of Boulogne, was a different kind of man entirely from his pious, straightforward older brother. Baldwin was clever, ambitious, utterly unsentimental about the gap between ideals and interests, and in possession of a quality that would prove uniquely valuable on this particular expedition: a complete willingness to do whatever was necessary to advance his own position. He had no estate of his own, having been intended originally for the church before the death of an older brother redirected his career toward arms. He had a wife who had come with him on the journey. He had, in short, everything to gain and very little to lose, which is the most dangerous combination in a man of his abilities. Baldwin would not follow his brother all the way to Jerusalem. He would stop along the way at a different city, for a different prize, and in doing so would become one of the most consequential figures of the entire crusading movement, though not in the ways that anyone at Clermont could have anticipated. Chapter 14. Bohemond of Taranto, the dangerous Norman. Of all the leaders of the First Crusade, none was more physically impressive, none more militarily talented, and none more completely self-interested than Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince who had grown up in southern Italy under the shadow of his father, Robert Guiscard, the greatest adventurer of the 11th century. Bohemond was enormous. Contemporary accounts describe him as standing head and shoulders above other men, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with close-cropped fair hair and blue eyes that observers found disconcertingly direct. He was in his mid-40s when the crusade began, at the height of his physical powers, and with 15 years of serious military campaigning behind him. He spoke several languages. He had studied military history. He was capable of both brilliant tactical improvisation in the heat of battle and careful long-term strategic planning, a combination of qualities that was genuinely rare in any age. He had also fought the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos before, on the losing side, during a Norman invasion of the Balkans in the early 1080s. He and Alexios knew each other. They had met, had sparred, had tested each other's abilities, and had come away from the experience with a mutual respect that was inseparable from a mutual wariness. Alexios knew Bohemond was brilliant and dangerous and entirely untrustworthy. Bohemond knew Alexios was clever and patient, and entirely capable of managing him, if he was not very careful. Bohemond saw in the crusade an opportunity that most men in his position would never be offered. He was the eldest son of Robert Guiscard, but had been displaced from his inheritance by a younger half-brother, Roger Borsa, when Guiscard died. He held Taranto and some other territories in southern Italy, enough to live on but not enough to satisfy a man of his ambitions. The crusade, if it succeeded, would carry him into the rich territories of the eastern Mediterranean, where a man of military genius and ruthless calculation might carve out a domain worthy of his abilities. He took the cross in the autumn of 1096, legend says in a moment of theatrical impulsiveness. He was besieging Amalfi when he heard that the crusade was passing through the region, and he cut up his own cloak on the spot to make the cloth crosses that crusaders wore as their badge. Whether the story is true or not, it captures something real about Bohemond: his ability to make a gesture at exactly the right moment, to turn a practical calculation into a performance of conviction. He was, in addition to everything else, an extraordinarily effective showman. With him came his nephew Tancred, a young man in his early 20s, headstrong and energetic and possessed of a crusading zeal that, in Tancred's case, appears to have been genuinely religious rather than merely strategic. Tancred would prove to be one of the most effective fighters of the whole campaign and would eventually play his own decisive role in its final act. Chapter 15. The Other Lords. Beyond these three figures, the organized crusade drew in a remarkable collection of the Western nobility's most significant members. Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, was the eldest son of William the Conqueror, which gave him both enormous prestige and a personal history that illustrated the Crusade's social function with particular clarity. Robert was a decent man, personally brave, well-liked by his knights, and almost constitutionally incapable of the hard administrative competence that effective rulership demanded. To raise the money he needed for the crusade, he mortgaged the entire Duchy of Normandy to his younger brother William Rufus, King of England, for the sum of 10,000 marks of silver. This was, by any measure, a spectacular commitment, the kind of all-in gamble that makes sense only if you genuinely believe you are doing God's work, and that God will therefore ensure a profitable outcome. Robert II, Count of Flanders, joined as well, bringing a seasoned military force from one of the most economically advanced regions of northern Europe. His father had served the Byzantine emperor as a mercenary commander, which gave Robert certain useful connections, and perhaps a slightly more realistic picture of what Byzantium was actually like than most of his colleagues possessed. Stephen, Count of Blois, was one of the richest men in France, married to Adela, a daughter of William the Conqueror, and possessed of a level of education and cultural refinement that made him more comfortable writing letters than fighting battles. He left behind a series of detailed, vivid, and touchingly optimistic letters to his wife describing the Crusade's progress, letters that would later contrast painfully with his actual behavior at the expedition's most critical moment. Stephen would become the Crusade's most famous coward, a cautionary tale whose ending would eventually compel him back to the East to redeem his reputation at the cost of his life. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, rounded out the roster of the most prominent leaders, bringing royal blood to an enterprise conspicuously lacking in crowned heads. He crossed the Adriatic early, was shipwrecked, and arrived at Constantinople in a sorry enough state to deprive him of the authority his birth might otherwise have commanded. Chapter 16: The World That Sent Them. The men who took the cross in response to Urban's call at Clermont came from a world whose physical and social reality was as different from our own as it is possible to imagine while remaining recognizably human. To understand what they were leaving behind when they set out for Jerusalem, and what they were risking, it is worth pausing to look at that world in some detail. The great majority of people in Western Europe in 1096 were peasants, farmers who worked the land under conditions of dependency that ranged from severe to crushing. The legal and social category most characteristic of the age was serfdom, a condition in which a person was bound to a particular piece of land and to the lord who owned it, required to render labor services on the lord's fields in addition to farming their own, subject to fees and fines and obligations that consumed much of what they produced, and unable to leave or marry or pass their property to their children without the Lord's permission. It was not slavery, but it was not freedom. It was a condition designed above all to keep agricultural labor where it was needed, and to extract maximum value from it for those at the top of the social hierarchy. The peasant's world was small in the most literal sense. Most people in the 11th century lived and died within a radius of perhaps 20 or 30 miles from the place of their birth. The next village was familiar, the next town was exotic, the next kingdom was effectively the moon. When such people took the cross and set out on a journey to Jerusalem, they were not making a trip to a foreign country. They were stepping off the edge of the known world. Their diet was monotonous and often insufficient. Bread was the staple, dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley or mixed grain, nothing like the white wheat bread that was the luxury of the rich. Pottage, a thick soup of whatever grains and vegetables the season provided, filled in around the bread. Meat was a rare luxury for most, available at the great feast days of the church's calendar and at harvest time, but absent from most ordinary days. Fish, particularly salted or dried fish, was more common in regions near water but still not abundant. Wine was drunk in the south where grapes grew, ale in the north where they did not. The result was a diet chronically low in protein and frequently inadequate in calories, producing people who were on average significantly smaller and physically weaker than their modern counterparts, and who faced disease with immune systems that had been compromised by persistent malnutrition. The knight who fought his way across Anatolia and the anonymous foot soldier who trudged beside him came from very different worlds. The knight's world was one of relative abundance: meat at most meals, white bread, good wine, fine clothing of wool and linen, sometimes silk from the East, and a material standard of living that, while nothing like the luxury of Constantinople or the wealthier Islamic cities, was comfortable by contemporary Western standards. His war horse was worth more than a peasant family's entire holding. His armor, a hauberk of mail rings hand-linked from iron wire, represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor. His sword was a precision instrument whose manufacture required knowledge and craft that were not widely distributed. Everything about the mounted knight bespoke surplus. The surplus of time to train for war rather than work the land, the surplus of wealth to buy the equipment and the horses, the surplus of social confidence that came from knowing that you occupied the top of the hierarchy and that the world was arranged for your benefit. And yet the knight was not happy, or rather the knight was not at rest. The social system that produced him also created enormous structural frustrations. The rule of primogeniture, by which the eldest son inherited the family estates, left younger sons with a horse, a sword, and no obvious way to use them profitably. Younger sons of noble families had a choice of careers that reduced in practice to two: the church or the sword. Many chose the church and became the often worldly, often militarized, bishops and abbots that the reform movement was trying to discipline. Many more chose the sword and became the pool of aggressive, well-armed, militarily skilled, and economically insecure young men who were simultaneously the greatest security problem of the age and the perfect material for a crusade. The church had been trying for decades to manage this surplus of warriors through what it called the peace of God and the truce of God, movements that attempted to restrict when and against whom fighting was permitted. The peace of God prohibited attacks on non-combatants, priests, monks, merchants, peasants, women, the poor. The truce of God prohibited fighting on holy days, during Advent and Lent, and during other sacred times. Neither movement was very effective. Knights fought when they judged it expedient, not when a bishop told them it was permissible. But both movements represented the church's awareness that the violence of the military class was a structural problem that required structural solutions, and Urban's call at Clermont was, among other things, the most ambitious structural solution yet attempted: redirect the violence outward, toward an enemy that the church itself had designated, and in doing so both channel the violence away from Christian society and place the church at the center of the enterprise. The March to Constantinople. Chapter 17. The Long Roads East. The armies of the First Crusade did not travel together. This was partly a matter of simple logistics. No single road could have fed and supplied the combined forces of all the great lords simultaneously, and the attempt would have produced the same kind of chaos and starvation that had destroyed the People's Crusade. But it was also a matter of politics and personality. The great lords had no intention of spending months in close proximity to their rivals before they had to. The feuds and tensions that already existed among them, the rivalry between Bohemond and Raymond that would shadow the whole enterprise, the pride of each lord that made subordination to any other lord instinctively objectionable. All of these made separate lines of march more congenial as well as more practical. Godfrey of Bouillon and his brothers led their Lorrainer force down the Danube road through Hungary, following the same path the People's Crusade had taken a few months earlier. Godfrey kept his men under much tighter discipline than Peter the Hermit had managed, negotiating with the Hungarian King Kalaman for safe passage and markets, and doing a considerably better job of preventing the kind of violence that had marked the People's Crusade's transit. The bones of Peter's followers still lay unburied beside the road in places, a reminder of what happened when a crusading army lost control of itself. Raymond of Toulouse led his southern French contingent down through the Balkans along the Adriatic coast, a miserable and exhausting route through what is now Croatia and Montenegro. The mountains were steep, the roads narrow and treacherous in winter, and the local Slavic population actively hostile, which meant that Raymond's force arrived in Byzantine territory considerably worse for wear than it had started. Bohemond took his Normans by sea across the Adriatic to the Byzantine coast of what is now Albania and Greece, marching overland from there through the very territory that he and his father had tried to conquer by force a decade earlier. He managed this transit with a diplomatic correctness that was, for a man of his history, almost startling, giving Alexios no legitimate grievance to seize on while at the same time preparing the ground for the negotiations he intended to conduct once he reached Constantinople. The northern French lords crossed the Alps into Italy and took ship for the short sea crossing to the Adriatic coast, or traveled overland through Italy to join the forces gathering there. Through the winter of 1096 and into the spring of 1097, these separate armies, each following its own route, each dealing with its own crises and conflicts along the way, converged on the single point that all had agreed to use as their gathering place: Constantinople, the golden city at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the gateway through which they would have to pass to reach the lands where Jerusalem waited. Chapter 18: The Emperor and His Visitors. Alexios Komnenos watched the approach of these armies with a combination of relief and alarm that no amount of diplomatic composure could entirely conceal. Relief, because he had asked for soldiers and soldiers were coming, eventually, in quantities that promised real military effectiveness. Alarm, because the soldiers coming were not the controllable mercenaries he had envisioned, but great independent lords at the head of substantial armies, men who answered to no authority but God's and their own judgment, who had their own ideas about what this expedition was for, and who were coming in numbers that vastly exceeded what Constantinople could comfortably manage. The fundamental problem was this: Alexios needed these men to fight for him, or at least in a way consistent with his interests. He needed them to recover Byzantine territory in Anatolia, which was the specific military purpose for which he had requested help. But these men had not come for Alexios's interests. They had come for Jerusalem, for the holy places, for the remission of their sins, and for whatever secular advantage they might pick up along the way. The alignment between what Alexios wanted and what the Crusaders wanted was imperfect at best, and at some points, directly contradictory. Alexios's response to this structural problem was a masterclass in the Byzantine art of political management. He had one overwhelming advantage: the Crusaders needed him. They needed his food and his markets. They needed his guides and his geographical knowledge. They needed his ships to carry them across the Bosphorus. And they needed the legitimizing presence of Byzantine authority as they moved through territories that were, at least nominally, disputed between Byzantium and the Turkish powers. Without Alexios's cooperation, the crusade would have been in serious difficulty before it even reached the battlefield. Using this leverage, the emperor set about extracting from each arriving leader two things that he considered essential. First, an oath of personal loyalty, binding them to him as lord to vassal, which would give him a legal and moral claim on their subsequent behavior. Second, and more concrete, a solemn promise that any city or territory that the Crusaders captured which had formerly belonged to the Byzantine Empire would be returned to imperial control. He had no intention of watching these Western lords carve out permanent domains on Byzantine territory at Byzantine expense. To extract these promises, Alexios deployed every resource at his disposal. He met the arriving leaders with the full ceremonial splendor of the Byzantine court, which was calibrated to make a rough Western count feel the full weight of the empire's antiquity and wealth. Gold mosaic, porphyry columns, silk draperies, an emperor seated on a throne that could be elevated mechanically above the level of the floor, flanked by gilded mechanical lions that roared and wagged their tails, surrounded by the elaborate ceremonial that the Byzantines had refined over centuries. All of this was designed not merely as decoration, but as a political statement, a reminder of the vast civilizational gap between Constantinople and the wooden hall of the most powerful Western lord. He also gave money, staggering quantities of gold and silver, fine cloth and jewels and horses, distributed among the leaders and their followers with a generosity calibrated to the political purpose of each gift. The Byzantines had long understood that there was no easier way to manage a proud man with insufficient resources than to give him what he needed at a moment when he felt obliged to you for it. And when generosity and ceremony were insufficient, he used pressure. He controlled the food supply. He could open or close the markets through which the Crusaders drew their provisions. A lord who refused to take the oath while well-fed and comfortable often found himself more philosophically flexible once the supply of bread and meat had been restricted for a few days. Chapter 19. The negotiations case by case. Each of the great lords went through his own version of the confrontation with Alexios's requirements, and each resolved it in his own way, revealing in the process something of his character. Hugh of Vermandois arrived first, in poor condition after his shipwreck, and swore the required oaths without particular difficulty, grateful for the imperial hospitality that was offered to him, and perhaps not fully understanding the implications of what he was committing to. He was, in any case, not important enough for the subtleties to matter much. Godfrey of Bouillon arrived with his force and refused to swear. He had already sworn personal loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor, and did not see why he should duplicate that oath in favor of a Greek ruler he had only just met. The standoff between Godfrey and Alexios dragged on through the winter, with Godfrey's men camped outside the walls, growing hungry and restless, and eventually beginning to raid the suburbs of Constantinople for the food they were not being provided. Alexios cut their supplies further. The Crusaders attacked Byzantine troops. There was real fighting, Christian against Christian, in the suburbs of the greatest Christian city in the world, before either side had encountered a single Turkish soldier. Alexios eventually brought up sufficient military force to make Godfrey's position untenable, and Godfrey, recognizing that he could not prevail in the emperor's own capital against the emperor's own army, took the oath. Alexios immediately rewarded him with gifts and hospitality, and the crisis passed. But the incident had been ugly, and it had established a precedent of mutual distrust that would color the entire subsequent relationship between the Crusaders and their Byzantine partner. Bohemond, when he arrived, did something that surprised everyone. He swore the oath without complaint, almost cheerfully, and urged the other lords to do the same. This was not because he had become less dangerous or less self-interested, but because he had decided that the path to what he wanted ran through Alexios's good favor rather than against it. He wanted the emperor to give him command of the Byzantine forces that would accompany the expedition, a position of authority that would have been enormously valuable for the pursuit of his private ambitions. If he could make himself seem cooperative and trustworthy at this stage, he could demand more later. Alexios was not deceived. He knew Bohemond's history and his character, and he knew that the Norman's compliance was tactical rather than genuine. But he accepted the oath and the cooperation that came with it, with equal tactical warmth and equal private skepticism. The two men circled each other throughout their meeting, each fully aware of the other's game, each performing a cordiality that neither felt, like two chess players who have been introduced at a social occasion and are sizing each other up for the match. Raymond of Toulouse was the most difficult case. The Count of Toulouse was the senior lay figure of the Crusade in terms of prestige and wealth, and he had a profound sense of his own dignity that made the swearing of an oath of vassalage to anyone other than God himself a serious affront. He argued at length with the emperor's representatives. He proposed alternatives. He stood on his right to have made the pilgrimage vow to God alone and to accept no earthly lord in the prosecution of it. In the end, Raymond and Alexios reached a compromise that satisfied neither entirely. Raymond would not swear the full feudal oath of vassalage. He would give his word, on his faith as a Christian and his honor as a knight, to respect the life and dignity of the emperor and to do nothing to harm his interests. It was less than Alexios wanted, and more than Raymond had initially been willing to give, and it left both men with grievances that they would nurse throughout the campaign. The Princess Anna Komnene, who would write the magnificent historical account of her father's reign decades later in her book The Alexiad, observed these Western lords in her childhood with a sharp and discriminating eye that she preserved in her writing. She found them by turns admirable and barbaric, marveling at their physical courage and the effectiveness of their heavy cavalry charge while deploring their greed, their lack of ceremony, and their tendency to interrupt the emperor's formal receptions by sitting down in his throne without permission. She was particularly struck by Bohemond, whose physical presence she described with an admiration that barely conceals what sounds very much like attraction, nodding that he was unlike any other man she had seen, as tall as the tallest, with a quality that she struggled to define, but that came through in her account as something between magnetism and menace. Through the winter and spring of 1097, the crusading armies gathered at Constantinople, crossed the Bosphorus on Alexios' ships, and assembled on the Asian shore. The emperor attached to the expedition a Byzantine officer named Tatikios, with a small force of Byzantine troops, whose formal purpose was to assist the Crusaders and to take possession in the emperor's name of any recovered cities. In practice, Tatikios' role was as much political as military, keeping Alexios informed of what was happening in the army and providing a visible symbol of the Byzantine partnership that the emperor needed to maintain if his long-term interests were to be protected. By the spring of 1097, the gathering was complete. The organized crusade was in Asia, ready to fight. Ahead of it lay the Turkish world that had absorbed Anatolia and pressed to the shores of the Bosphorus, and the first objective that stood between the crusade and all of its subsequent history was the great walled city of Nicaea. The Road to Nicaea. Chapter 20. The City and Its Walls. Nicaea was a city with a long and significant history, and its capture would carry meaning beyond the purely military. It sat on the eastern shore of a large inland lake, protected on three sides by formidable stone walls studded with more than 100 towers, and on the fourth by the lake itself, whose waters lapped directly against a section of the city's fortifications, making a complete encirclement by land forces impossible. The city's defenses had been built and reinforced over centuries of Byzantine rule, and they represented a serious challenge to any besieging force that could not bring naval power to bear on the lake. In the memory of the Crusaders, Nicaea had another significance entirely. It was the city where, in the year 325, the first great ecumenical council of the Christian Church had been held, convened by the Emperor Constantine the Great, and at which the fundamental statement of Christian belief, the Nicene Creed, had been formulated. It was a city whose name was spoken every Sunday in the churches of the West, every time the faithful recited the words of their faith. To recover it from the Turks was therefore not merely a military objective, but a symbolic act of the first order, the first great blow struck for the liberation of Christian places from Muslim rule. As the seat of the Sultanate of Rum, Nicaea was also the political center of the Turkish power that was the Crusade's immediate military opponent. Kilij Arslan's court was here, his treasury, his administrative apparatus. Taking Nicaea would not destroy the Sultanate of Rum, but it would deal it a severe blow and open the road into the Anatolian interior. The crusading armies arrived before Nicaea in the middle of May 1097. They were not yet the unified force they would eventually become. The different lords took different sections of the siege perimeter, Godfrey's Lorrainers on one side, Bohemond's Normans on another, Raymond's Southern French filling in when they arrived a few days later. The various contingents set up their camps, staked out their sectors, and began the methodical business of a siege. Chapter 21: The Sultan's Miscalculation. Kilij Arslan was not in Nicaea when the Crusaders arrived. He had marched east to deal with a conflict with a rival Turkish power, the Danishmend Turks of central Anatolia, leaving his capital under the command of his garrison, and with his treasury and his family still inside, apparently confident that the city could defend itself, and that the Frankish threat was not serious enough to require his immediate attention. This was a miscalculation whose cause is understandable. Kilij Arslan had faced the People's Crusade and destroyed it easily. He had every reason to believe that the new army approaching his capital was more of the same. He was wrong, and the news that reached him within days of the siege's beginning disabused him of this comfortable assumption with brutal efficiency. A real army, organized, disciplined, equipped, and led by experienced commanders, was sitting before his city, and his garrison, however brave and however effectively the lake kept it supplied, could not hold out indefinitely against a force of this quality. Kilij Arslan did what a good sultan was supposed to do. He made peace with his rivals as quickly as possible and marched back at the head of all the men he could assemble. His strategic objective was to break the siege from the outside by attacking the besieging army in the rear, while the garrison sallied out through the gates to strike from the front. It was a classic relief of siege strategy, and it had every chance of working against a disorganized or poorly led force. He arrived in the middle of May and launched his attack against the section of the perimeter held by Raymond of Toulouse's southern French. What followed was the first real engagement between the organized crusade and a Turkish army, and the outcome was a revelation to both sides. Raymond's force held. The Turkish cavalry attacked with their customary combination of speed, archery, and feigned retreat, and the southern French knights stood their ground and threw them back. The fighting was hard and the losses on both sides were real, but when the day was done, the Turks had been repulsed and the siege line was intact. Kilij Arslan drew off into the hills with his surviving force, acknowledging by his withdrawal that he could not save the city by direct assault. He sent word to the garrison that it should negotiate the best terms it could. The garrison, surrounded and increasingly aware of the limits of the lake as a supply route, chose to fight on regardless, and the siege settled into a grinding routine of assault and defense. Chapter 22: The Solution to the Lake. The lake was the central problem. As long as it remained open to the city, supplies and reinforcements could reach the garrison by boat, making the siege indefinite. The Crusaders needed to close it, which meant putting warships on the lake. But there was no water connection between the sea and the inland lake. There was no way to sail ships to it. The solution that the Crusaders devised, with Alexios's logistical support, was one of the most remarkable feats of engineering in the campaign. Boats were collected from the port of Sivtat on the Sea of Marmara. Then, instead of trying to find a water route that did not exist, the Crusaders and their Byzantine partners loaded the boats onto wheeled carriages and rollers, hitched them to teams of oxen and groups of men, and hauled them overland, mile after mile across dry ground, from the sea to the shore of the lake. The feat took enormous effort and coordination, and it impressed contemporaries who described it in terms that make clear they found it almost unbelievable. But it worked. One morning, the defenders of Nicaea looked out across the lake that had been their lifeline and saw it covered with warships flying imperial banners. The last gap in their encirclement suddenly and completely closed. The strategic situation had changed fundamentally in a single night. Chapter 23: The Byzantine Coup. With the lake closed and the encirclement complete, the fall of Nicaea was only a matter of time. The Crusaders, who had been looking forward to the final assault and the plunder that accompanied a city taken by storm, began preparing for the grand attack that would end the siege. Alexios had no intention of allowing that to happen. A city taken by storm in the medieval manner was a city sacked, its population slaughtered or enslaved, its wealth looted, its buildings left as ruins. Nicaea was a city that Alexios intended to rule again, a city full of his subjects and the accumulation of their generations of labor. He had no desire to watch it destroyed by his allies, especially allies who had promised in their oaths to return recovered Byzantine territory to imperial control. So, operating through secret channels that the Byzantine bureaucracy excelled at, Alexios opened negotiations with the Turkish garrison. He offered them honorable terms of surrender to the emperor rather than to the Franks. He guaranteed their lives and reasonable treatment. He offered money to the garrison commanders. And on the night of June 1819, 1097, while the Crusaders were sleeping in their camps and preparing for the morning's assault, the garrison of Nicaea opened the gates to Byzantine troops and surrendered the city to the emperor. The Crusaders woke the next morning to find imperial troops inside the walls and imperial banners flying from the towers. Nicaea had fallen not to them but to Alexios, without the assault, without the battle, and without the plunder that was the traditional reward of those who stormed a city and paid for it in blood. The reaction in the Crusader camp was predictable: fury, sullenness, and a grievance that would fester for months. They had done the fighting, the dying, the engineering, and the patience of 8 weeks of siege, and at the last moment the Greeks had walked in and taken the prize. Alexios, understanding that he had given offense and needing to manage the damage, distributed generous gifts among all the leaders and all the troops, enough gold and silver, and supplies to take the immediate edge off the anger, but not enough to heal the fundamental wound to the relationship between the Crusade and its Byzantine partner. The taking of Nicaea revealed, in miniature, the central problem of the whole Crusade. The interests of the Crusaders and the interests of Alexios were not identical, and when they diverged, neither party had a reliable mechanism for resolving the conflict. The oaths sworn at Constantinople were one such mechanism, but they were contested from the moment they were sworn, and the events at Nicaea made it easier to argue that they bound no one to anything. Into Anatolia. Chapter 24. The Road from Nicaea. The crusading army that marched out from Nicaea at the end of June 1097 was in far better condition than the force that would eventually reach Jerusalem. It was large, disciplined, well supplied by Alexios's provisions, and still possessed of the organizational structure and the morale that would be slowly eroded by the months of suffering to come. The leaders had established a working command arrangement, dividing the march into different divisions under different lords, with the Normans of Bohemond and Robert of Flanders in the vanguard, followed by the other contingents in sequence. The decision was made to divide the army into 2 marching columns as they advanced into Anatolia, partly to ease the logistical burden of feeding such a large force off a land that had no adequate road network and partly to cover more ground. Bohemond and his Normans, with Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Stephen of Blois, and the Byzantine general Tatikios, took the vanguard and marched ahead. Godfrey, Raymond, and the rest followed at some distance behind. It was a decision made for sound practical reasons. It was also the decision that Kilij Arslan had been waiting and hopping for. Chapter 25. The Battle of Dorylaeum. On the morning of July 1, 1097, Bohemond's forward column made camp in a broad, open valley near a site called Dorylaeum, the ruins of an ancient Roman town on the edge of the Anatolian plateau. They were perhaps a day's march ahead of the main force, and Kilij Arslan, who had been watching their approach and husbanding his forces since the fall of Nicaea, had chosen this moment and this place with care. At first light, the Turkish army came down on the camp. It was an enormous force, considerably larger than what the Sultan had committed at Nicaea, because he had used the weeks since that defeat to make peace with the Danishmen Turks and recruit additional contingents from across Anatolia. And it attacked in the manner that Central Asian horse archers had been perfecting for centuries, a manner for which the Western knights, with their tradition of the close quarters shock charge, had no effective counter. The Turkish cavalry swept around the Crusader camp in a wide, fast arc, deploying faster than the confused and surprised Crusaders could respond, and then they began to shoot. They came in close enough to make their arrows effective, loosed their shafts with a speed and accuracy that contemporaries described with a mixture of admiration and terror, and then wheeled away before the heavy Western horsemen could close with them. When the Crusaders charged, the Turks simply scattered before them and then closed in again from the sides and rear, keeping up the arrow storm from every direction at once. The thunder of drums and the wailing of horns and war cries added to the disorientation of men who had never faced anything like this. Bohemond, caught in a position that would have destroyed a lesser commander, grasped the tactical situation immediately and made the decision that saved the day. He ordered his knights not to charge, not to chase the Turkish horsemen who were deliberately drawing them away from their defensive formation. Instead, he pulled the entire column back onto a patch of ground protected by a river and marshy reeds, where their flanks were anchored and they could not be completely surrounded. The non-combatants, the women and clergy and servants who accompanied every medieval army, were gathered in the center. The infantry and archers formed the perimeter. The cavalry packed in behind them as a reserve, with orders to hold and wait. For hours, the Turks circled and shot, and the Crusaders endured it. It was a brutal, grinding ordeal under the summer sun, with water running short and the arrow casualties mounting, and the line wavering more than once as the pressure built to an almost unbearable intensity. The women of the camp, whose presence in medieval armies is often unremarked by historians, were specifically noted by several chroniclers for moving among the fighting men carrying water to the wounded and the exhausted, a detail that speaks both to the reality of what women did on campaign and to the degree to which the chroniclers were moved by it. Bohemond had done one other essential thing at the start of the battle. He had sent riders galloping back to find the second column and bring it up at full speed. The fate of the entire expedition now depended on whether that second column could arrive before the defensive perimeter gave way. It arrived around midday. Godfrey and Raymond and their forces had received the messenger, had understood the emergency, and had driven their men forward in a punishing forced march under the July sun, arriving on the field in time to strike the Turkish encirclers from the flank. And Bishop Edhemer of Lepi, the Pope's own representative, led a detachment on a wide sweeping circuit around the hills and fell on the Turks from behind. Suddenly, the encirclers were themselves encircled. The Turkish army, which fought magnificently when it held the initiative of speed and surprise, had no answer to being pinned in place and struck from three directions simultaneously. The whole host broke and fled, abandoning their camp with its tents and stores and treasure, leaving their horses and their equipment behind in their haste to escape. Kilij Arslan himself escaped with his life and little else. The Crusaders surged forward and overran the camp, finding more provisions and more horses than they had possessed before the battle. The losses on their side had been significant, good men and many precious war horses killed, but they had won a victory that was both militarily decisive and psychologically transformative. They had been ambushed at a disadvantage, outnumbered, and subjected to the full force of the Turkish cavalry tactics, and they had prevailed. They were not the People's Crusade. They were something qualitatively different. Chapter 26, The Scorched Plateau. Kilij Arslan drew the lesson from Dorylium with the clarity of a man whose professional survival depended on accurate assessment. He could not stop this army in the field. His cavalry tactics, which had been so devastatingly effective against the People's Crusade, had failed against an organized force that refused to be drawn out of its defensive formation, and that had the numbers and the discipline to bring its full strength to bear. He would not fight another Dorylium. Instead, the Sultan adopted a strategy that would prove far more dangerous to the Crusaders in the weeks to come than any cavalry charge. He withdrew before them, and as he withdrew, he destroyed everything that the army behind him might use. Wells were filled with rubble or poisoned. Crops were burned. the standing grain of an entire harvest set alight before the Crusaders' advancing eyes. Livestock was driven off. Villages were emptied and their stores destroyed. The Sultan was going to let the land itself do his fighting for him. The Crusaders marched across the high Anatolian plateau in the heat of July and August, and the march was a nightmare from which there seemed no waking. The temperature on the plateau could reach 40 degrees Celsius in midsummer, a scorching, dry heat that sucked the moisture from man and animal alike. There was no water. The wells that generations of Anatolian farmers had dug were ruined. The streams and springs that a pet